Mr. Kimmage, I read one of your interviews in March, maybe a couple of weeks after the war started, and you were saying that the scenario when Ukraine defeats Russia was not likely, but possible. Was that successful counteroffensive expected at all?
Well, I think everybody was predicting a counteroffensive in a way it was announced by the Ukrainian government. So the fact of the counteroffensive was not a surprise. I think that the Ukrainian government succeeded in a sense, fooling many audiences, including most importantly the Russian military, by preparing the grounds for an attack on Kherson, but in fact dividing the army and making a move on the area around Kharkiv. I certainly was surprised. I had the impression that really much of the world was surprised by the audacity of the plan and by the amount of military capacity that the Zelensky government seems to have at its disposal.
In Kherson region, as far as I understand, they are moving forward slower than in the Kharkiv region. What can we expect in the next few weeks?
Well, I think clearly the Russian military moved much of its firepower to the area around Kherson, and they've of course been digging in there for quite a while. So it's not an easy campaign by any means. It's moving slowly. It's hard for me to predict how it will turn out. All I know is that there are serious questions of supply that affect the Russian soldiers, and one has to imagine, although perhaps it will work a little bit differently after the events of the last couple of days, that the morale problems that the Russian soldiers around Kharkiv had might be similar in Kherson, in which case the Ukrainian military would have an advantage. But I don't think it's necessarily the case that the Ukrainian military can translate its successes around Kharkiv into those around Kherson. They can only try to have that degree of success, but it may be much more difficult.
This week, the New York Times posted an article about how U.S. intelligence helped Ukraine to plan the counteroffensive, how throughout the war, the United States has provided Ukraine with all kinds of information and so on. What played the most significant role in that counteroffensive? Western weapons, Western help in general, Ukrainian professionalism?
I think it has to be a combination of all of those things. Obviously, the professionalism of the Ukrainian military is important. So is the morale of the troops, and so is the quality of Ukrainian military planning. It was a daring attack on the Russian soldiers in the area of Kharkiv, and in the end, a successful one. But it was, a fairly startling decision on the part of Ukrainian political leadership, and suggests that the decision-making quality is quite high. I mean, I think the supporting role that is played by especially American intelligence in this case is very significant. And then you have the provision of different kinds of long-range missiles that weren't necessarily used in the attack itself, but have been used in the last couple of weeks to destroy Russian ammunition depots and to complicate logistics. And I think you saw the effects of that over the last couple of days. So it's a combination, but I think the laurel wreaths of victory have to go to the Ukrainian military first and foremost.
Can we say that the last weekend was the turning point and now the advantage is on the Ukraine side?
I think with some qualifications that is true. I think that in a structural sense, and this is the work of many analysts, not just my own personal opinion, Ukraine has, sort of two basic advantages at the moment, and one is manpower, and the other is weaponry and ammunition. So the question really was, and you can have those advantages in theory or on paper, and not know how to use them. The question was, is the military able to put those advantages to use? And I think the answer is obvious now that yes, they can. And so this makes the structural disadvantages of the Russian army all the more acute. They're stretched thin. They're fighting on a very long front. They don't have the manpower reserves that they need. I don't think anybody really knows about equipment and ammunition, but there may be difficulties there as well. So if Russia is thinking of a 10-year war, it has lots of resources on which it can draw, to be sure. It's not to say that the war is going to come to a quick conclusion, but for the next 6 months or perhaps the next year, the advantages are going to be more on the Ukrainian side.
I think there is one more big advantage, big Ukrainian advantage, motivation, because Ukrainian soldiers they know what are they fighting for, and in Russia, I think people are demotivated and they don't understand actually what's the purpose of that war or so-called special operation.
I think that's very well put. The way I would express it, it's not as if Russia has no war aims. It does have war aims. I mean, going from the retaking of Donetsk and Luhansk that was mentioned at the beginning of the war. Then you have denazification, demilitarization, which are difficult to understand outside the language of the Kremlin, but are stated aims of the Russian government. And more, sort of acutely, you can see that Russia wishes to acquire a kind of control over Ukraine's political future. Those are all realizable goals, and I'm sure the Russian soldiers are aware of them. But the thing is, these goals are very abstract. None of them is direct, immediate, or emotional. So the contrast with Ukraine, which is fighting for its life, is really extreme. Ukraine also has goals in the war. Those are easily comprehensible to everybody who's fighting, and they're not abstract. They're sort of life and death, flesh and blood, military reasons. So I think the abstraction of the Russian war aims is a very, very difficult factor when it comes to the motivation of Russian soldiers on the ground.
You probably know that there is a lot of criticism now towards Russian officials, Russian authorities, even in the patriotic social media accounts in Russia, from those who actually support the war. What can it lead to? To the escalation, to the further aggression towards Ukraine, or maybe it can change finally the public opinion and make people protest against the war and against Putin personally?
If I had to guess, I would go a little bit more with the latter part of your question. I think that escalatory options for Putin at the moment, they exist, but they're not very good. He would pay a very high political price for mass conscription, and it's not really clear to me, looking at the situation as soberly as I can, that simply putting more soldiers into the theater, into the military situation, would necessarily change the fortunes of the Russian military. They have strategic problems. We mentioned a moment ago the kind of problems of political concept. Mobilization doesn't solve those problems. In some ways, it might make those problems worse. So I think mobilization is a very difficult option for Putin to select, in which case, if you have nationalist, pro-military discontent, and if it starts to get expressed, and if it starts to become public, I think it just feeds into what may be broader discontent about the nature of Putinism, about the war itself, and of course about the coming economic price or costs that are going to be paid because of the sanctions. It may not be over the summer, it may not be September, October, November, but probably by the spring, everyday Russians are going to start paying a real cost for the war. So all of that could become quite significant frustration. Revolutionary frustration, I'm not sure. I think it's a long way till we get to that point, but frustration of a kind that could make Putin's life much more difficult.
What does Ukraine need now to maintain this position, and what determines its further success?
Well, I think the answer is, in a certain sense, simple. Obviously, it needs as much Western military support as possible. I think it's just going to want, in a way, either more of the same or more sophisticated weaponry. And there's, a tug of war between Ukraine and Germany about the provision of tanks. And, I'm sure that there's back and forth between Kiev and Washington on the exact nature of the military support. But the successes on the battlefield are going to certainly help with that. I think the other domain for Ukraine, certainly, and it may be a more complicated one than the military domain, is economic. The Ukrainian economy is suffering enormously because of the war. Investment has stopped. It's been difficult to move goods to outside markets. It's going to need, Ukrainian government is going to need infusions of cash. And this is at a time when Western governments are burdened by high inflation, high energy costs, and that could be a serious problem in the future. But for the time being, I think Ukraine's position is quite positive.